Favourites podcast, and uh, I know that last time we had a podcast, I said as we finished the book of 1 Chronicles that we were going to go straight into 2 Chronicles. However, I thought it would be worth us spending a bit of time in a New Testament book. And you remember that when we will go back to 2 Chronicles, but we're going to do this first. Was this when we started looking at 1 Chronicles? I shared how the big reason why I wanted to tackle that was because it felt like a neglected book of the Bible. And there are obviously great sections of the Old Testament that really don't get enough attention, that feel underrepresented in our preaching and our teaching and our writing. But there are also bits of the New Testament that don't get as much attention as others as well. And one of those would be the book of Revelation. And I want to suggest that also not just the book of Revelation, but also there's been a general neglect when it comes to teaching on the second coming of Jesus and what we sometimes refer to as the end times, or more technically, eschatology. If you were to ask any evangelical pastor whether they believed in the literal and imminent return of Jesus Christ, the second coming, I'm confident that they would say, "Of course I do." But you might be forgiven for saying, "All of the evidence suggests that you don't." I've been part of your church, part of your churches for a year, for 5 years, for 10 years, for all my life, and I don't think I've really heard these things mentioned. And even when they are mentioned, there seems to be a bit of embarrassment about them. And I think that the reason for that is this: we've become theoretical believers in the second coming, but it hasn't shaped our practice because we had our fingers burnt. Go back to the late part of the 20th century, the sort of 1970s, 1980s, and there was a particular interest in the return of Jesus and the end of the world. And there were a couple of things affecting that. First, the approach of the millennium of the year 2000, that felt like a significant date. The experience of the Cold War, the shadow of nuclear Armageddon, a lot of fear. And that created an environment where there was a lot of discussion about Jesus would come back and how the world would end and who the Antichrist was and those kinds of things. And that resulted in 2 problems. First, some people tried to force fit what they were reading in the Bible onto the events that they were witnessing. I started to attempt to do what Jesus warned strongly against, to narrow things down to dates and times, to argue passionately that this person or that person might be the Antichrist, or at least the precursor to him, whether that was popes or leaders of the European Union or the Russian leaders. That big fear that Russia and the Cold War would be the cause, a conflict between America and Russia would be the cause of a nuclear Armageddon that would trigger the end times. And the Soviet Union and the shift in historical focus and political focus left a lot of people with egg on their faces and left a lot of people rather cynical to those attempts to predict. Of course, it's now that Russia again might be in a place to play a big role in ushering in the end times as Vladimir Putin um, threatens the world. But we can't make those kinds of predictions. and we will be wise not to. So some people were left with egg on their faces, and others just got themselves tied up in knots with these sort of bizarre and novel theories. And not only did they advance these theories, but they got so attached to their view that they would fall out and argue in a really unhealthy way with other Christians, and it became divisive. And so there's been a nervousness, a reluctance, a fear of getting into the end times, getting into eschatology, getting into the book of Revelation, because it's seen as something that is the preserve of obsessives, because it's seen as something that leaves you looking silly, and because it's seen as something that causes division in the church. And that's very sad, because the fact that Jesus is coming back is good news. And the book of Revelation itself promises that those who read it, the readers of the book and the hearers and the doers of the book, will be given a special, particular blessing. There is good reason to get into the book of Revelation, the promise that if you do, you will be blessed. And that's the experience I've seen. I know that when we preached through the book of Revelation at our last church, the elders took through that book. There were a lot of people nervous for all those reasons about getting into the book, but the same people came back at the end and said, "I'm so glad that we spent. You will be too." It's this book of Revelation. Well, first of all, it's a letter. It's a letter from an author who identified himself, John. Every good reason to identify John as being the apostle, the eyewitness of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Secondly, it identifies as prophecy. And that means that we can expect it to do a couple of things. The main thing about prophecy is that it gives God's analysis, God's verdict on events and on life and on our circumstances. That includes his verdict on the past, on the present, but also on the future. So, yes, it will predict the future, but that's not all that prophecy does. This is a very particular type of prophecy. It's sometimes referred to as apocalyptic literature. There's a couple of sister books in the Old Testament. The book of Daniel particularly follows this type of genre. And apocalyptic literature is a style of writing, a type of book that has a particular concern for how we respond to rising evil, prevalent suffering. And it contains the idea that in the face of rising evil and prevalent suffering, that God has called out a remnant of faithful people who he will keep secure and safe through persecution and enable to be overcomers, to be conquerors, to stand firm and righteous in him. That's exactly what you see happening in the book of Revelation. Apocalyptic literature uses a lot of symbolism, a lot of picture language. It uses very colourful vocabulary. Its message, and you'll see a lot of that in the book of Revelation as well. It's often associated with dreams and visions. And in terms of the book of Revelation as apocalyptic literature, what I suggest to you is this, that its aim is this: Revelation gives us God's view from the perspective of the end of the whole of salvation history. So we are getting God's view from heaven, his high and exalted view of what has been happening throughout the whole of history. And it gives us that view so that we stand with God looking back, that he takes us through this book to the end and helps us to look back and see all that he has been doing, all that he has been accomplishing, so that we can understand those events, both in history and practically, and perhaps most immediately importantly, in terms of what is happening now. From the perspective of the end, we get God's verdict, what is happening now, so that we can understand and know how to live as God's people in the world right now. What that means is this: if the book of Revelation is God's verdict on the whole of history from the perspective of the end to help us live now, then it is relevant to us. It isn't just a book about things that will happen in the last 3 weeks of time, a period when many of us expect that we won't be physically present because we'll have already died and gone to be with Jesus. If that was what it was about, we might think, well, it's interesting, but it's not that immediately relevant. That it is practically relevant to your life, to my life, to the life and work of the church now. So I hope I've whetted your appetite. I hope that you are excited and encouraged about listening along over the next few weeks. Just also to say as well that if you prefer to read, or you like to both read and listen, everything that I'm going to be talking through in these next few weeks is available already in written form. You can get some of the material in a PDF book called Return of the King, which is available from the Faith Roots publication page. There are also past blog articles, and we'll put some links to them up as well. Thanks as always for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your day and your week.